Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming to the Talks for Teachers. I am Dr. Abigail Boucher,
Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Jenkins-Smith.
and today we're here to talk to you about tragedy, the Great Gatsby, and gaze theory. Now, this isn't going to be structured as a normal lecture style paper. Daniel and I are actually going to deliver this a little bit more as a sort of co-teaching dialogue.
Yeah, we're going to have a look at these three kind of topics relatively separately and then see how they might all work together.
Yeah, as a sort of synthesis of all of these at the end
Yes.
after we go through them all individually. So the first thing that we are going to look at is the history of tragedy, which is quite a broad field, I think. There have been a lot of work done in this. We're just going to give you a very rough overview.
Yeah, well, probably all I'm capable of giving. I'm not a classicist or anything, but yeah, we're all probably familiar with tragedy's ancient origins in Greece. Theorized by Aristotle in the Poetics, where he kind of introduces all those themes all those terms maybe that we know, like the tragic hero and the hamartia, the fatal flaw. And importantly, he says that like the hamartia is more just an error, the wrong decision at the wrong time, rather than some kind of fundamental problem with the hero themselves. So that's something interesting and worth bearing in mind.
This was a big part of Athenian culture. Am I right in thinking that, or remembering that it was almost a jury duty sort of situation where people participated? Have
I
you
think
heard that?
yeah, there's a kind of weird continuity between politics, religion, and culture in ancient Athens, or at least those categories weren't as separate as maybe we would class them.
Yeah, I was thinking about how deeply embedded this is in Athenian culture and the sort of the structure of it. So we talk about tragedy as a genre, and this is going to be something that we explore, especially as we get closer to The Great Gatsby. And what do we even mean by tragedy? So, I mean, Aristotle here had a sort of formula. He's given a sort of definition a little bit, but it's even more formulaic than that. So this idea is the reversal, discovery, and calamity. So there's some sort of problem or breaking with the norm, a sort of revelation or understanding of where that problem originated with, and then death. Nice, neat resolution there at the end.
Yeah. Or some kind of horrible event in any case. Yeah, Aristotle views it almost in like mechanistic terms. And when you look at a tragedy like Oedipus or something, you can kind of see where he's getting it from, that there is this sense of clockwork determining everything, which I suppose plays into this idea that fate is the key aspect of the ancient tragedy, or the key motor of the ancient tragic plot.
And the structure of these as well, in terms of it had to follow the sort of the unities. This all had to take place more or less over the course of a day, all in roughly one location. So it was very structured, and if you sort of broke with that, it wasn't anything. It was sort of, it's almost like poetry in that regard, before we get to modernist poetry and things, where if it doesn't fulfill all of these conditions, it's not a tragedy, it's not even a play, it's nothing. So
Yeah,
it is
you've got to tick
very,
certain boxes. Yeah, you
yes,
can't let one
exactly.
of them go.
Yeah, I know that George Steiner's major work on tragedy discusses this. He discusses how stark these conventions are of classical tragedy. It's almost a sort of paint by numbers situation. And he talks about how there are not only no wasted words or wasted scenes or things, but no wasted emotion. So it's very action driven, it's very circumstances driven. And I think it's the emergence of things like psychoanalysis much later that really reshapes this. I mean, obviously, we're going to talk about how this is reformed in the Shakespearean era and the Jacobean era,
Yeah,
when
a long
tragedy is
way
sort
yet
of
till
rediscovered.
psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So my question for you, I suppose, given that you and I have actually just read Oedipus, is why does tragedy exist? Especially this formulaic, especially when, as you're saying here, this fatal flaw is more just an ill-fated situation. What role is this serving in the community, if especially if everyone participated in it to some extent or saw it?
But there's the famous example, or the famous reason that Aristotle gives, that it provides a sense of catharsis, that it kind of purges the literal meaning of catharsis. It purges the sort of ill feeling maybe that's kind of bubbling up through the
Mhm.
community, or the anxieties of the community, and kind of manifest them in this incredibly extreme way that you can just kind of, you know, you watch this horrible thing happen to somebody else, and then you can kind of, go about your life again. I mean, what were you thinking? What
Well,
what is it for?
I wasn't sure because again, if it's framed in this, it's not a character defect, it's maybe just an ill-judged situation and reaction to it. There isn't necessarily, I mean, what do you learn from that? Is there a moral? And I was sort of wondering, especially with these sort of mass audience, not mass audience, but something that is sort of broad spectrum.
Participatory. Yeah.
Yes. So it's I was just wondering what we were supposed to take away from that, but I suppose catharsis maybe is that answer. I didn't know if is there anything maybe class based in that catharsis, because most of these early tragedies are sort of focused on the higher ups. It's focused on
Mm.
a great man and being swept up in fate and his great deeds. Is there some sort of catharsis in seeing a great man brought low? Because this is one of the elements that really changes as tragedy modernizes.
You would look at it maybe as like quite a conservative genre, wouldn't you, in the sense that it's not really about teaching people new lessons, even if it does explore certain philosophical issues in a kind of way that, in a kind of safe place, like to talk about taboo and stuff, like in the case of Oedipus. But nevertheless, it's still like, if you do the wrong things, bad things will happen for you, and also you can't escape the will of the gods. Oedipus didn't even really mean to do a bad thing. It was just fated that he would, and that's you can't control anything beyond that. So, like you were saying about the rules of tragedy being very fixed at this period, I mean, maybe it's just kind of, by extension, it's implying that the rules of the world are very fixed, and that, okay, we're this like kind of supposedly radical democratic state, but nevertheless, there are certain forms that we must all abide by. Within those, yeah, we can explore things, and we can have this kind of free place for debate and intellectual, development or whatever. Nevertheless, there are certain boundaries that are sacrosanct, and you cannot transgress those. I think
So I
that's probably the
wonder if it's then a combination of all of these things. It's some sort of catharsis of we see these terrible things happen in this sort of safe space where we can, articulate them and go through these emotions. It is reinforced that despite all of this, you need to obey the will of the gods, obey these power structures already in place. Don't even try to understand them. If it's fated, it's fated. But also, as part of that catharsis, if you're forced into these structures, at least you get to see a rich guy get his just desserts or something. I could see this as sort of catharsis and crowd control, but ultimately a sort of conservative
yeah.
sort of
But it's like
genre.
even the very best. I suppose that's almost what it's saying, isn't it? It's like,
Yes.
it's not just that, oh, you get the sort of Schadenfreude of seeing an aristocrat fall, but it's also like, yeah, look, this guy's better than you, and even he can't face,
Yes.
he can't best the gods. So I suppose, it kind of goes. There's a two-edged sword there, or whatever, a two-way street.
So then, as it said in our last slide, the tragedy as sort of a classical genre in that form disappeared from most of the medieval period. They had their own literary and theatrical traditions, and this was rediscovered in the Renaissance when the neoclassical sort of revival happened.
Mm.
So there was a similar formal tone. It did update slightly. So the new emphases, revenge gets to be a big one here. That's
Mm.
it's revenge with a bad ending. That's the sort of tragic element of it. And I was thinking that this revenge plot, this has had quite a long shelf life, because I'm sure it's cropped up certainly between the 16th century and the time period I'm about to talk about. But I was thinking of the 60s and 70s, 1960s and 70s, and all of
Yeah.
the
Oh, yeah.
revenge films that we got. And then we got another spate of them in the late 90s and early 2000s. And these are specifically revenge tragedies as well. So it's this updated form. So
Yeah.
you have things like Bonnie and Clyde and the Wild Bunch, Billy Jack, even The Godfather to some extent can be read as a revenge tragedy, Straw Dogs. Um, and I think we're entering another period of that right now because we have with certain updated political movements like Me Too and things, you have Promising Young Woman
Oh
and
yeah,
Last Night in Soho and things like that, which are dabbling with this. So this has had quite a long shelf life.
that's weird, isn't it, as well? Because there's a kind of ambiguity there, probably, but of a different kind to that within the Greek tradition. That it's more about individual agency, isn't it? Even with like the
Mm,
Shakespearean tragedies, like Hamlet could, you know, act on his apparent volition to, wreak vengeance on
mhm.
Claudius whenever he wants to, but he kind of errs about it. So it's more about his wavering. It really is a flaw in his case, whereas Oedipus had no real choice.
I
But so
yes,
it's a kind of cathartic thing, isn't it, to see revenge take place and to see like supposed wrongdoers get their comeuppance. But equally,
we
as these revenge
introduce
well, I mean, what happens to you in the process? You kind of dehumanize yourself, and you are the person trying to get revenge often has a sticky end as well, don't they? So it it's kind of exploring the idea of revenge rather than coming down on whether it's worth doing or not.
yeah, it's that idea of the fatal flaw and what people are fighting against or what the antagonist is. So in classical antiquity, it's just the will of the gods, it's fate, there's
Mm,
nothing you can do. Here it is sort of more individual, um a wrong been done to you, but then in trying to combat that, it's whatever character flaw you have. So this is much more individualized. I think the films and plays and things that we're getting nowadays, it's much more structural. It's fate in a sort of different way. So it's
mm,
you going up against the system, whether that's economic or gender or it's all of these different sort of the way the world is structured and sort of railing against that. And formally, this is where things really start to shift. Because, as you say here, there's a formal whimsy. We integrate scenes of comedy quite a lot. Shakespeare was sort of loathed for this by
mm.
contemporaries and even people in the couple of centuries thereafter, saying, why are we opening this tragedy with this hilarious, scene of people scamping around town and servants insulting each other and things like that.
Yeah,
Um,
drinking parties and stuff.
yeah, exactly. Uh, and we get yeah, plays within plays. We get sort of much more introspection. So before, when we talked about how it was a very stoic genre, there were no wasted words or emotions. Here, there's a lot of dithering and a lot of emotion. You almost can't get away
Mm.
from it, especially in things like Hamlet. It's all emotion, no action.
The kind of that brings you onto the sort of role of agency in it as well, doesn't it? Because I mean, there is a bit of this, like the idea of fate, like in the Greek ones. There's that, like star-crossed lovers, and there's that bit in King Lear where about astrology. But again, that's questioning it, isn't it? It's saying
Yes.
that, like, my dad Gloucester loves all of that stuff, but I'm not really, I don't really buy it. So, there are all these, there's an idea of fate, but it's also questioned. And then there's also a sort of, that's kind of replaced with like a kind of medicalized sense of the individual, isn't it? So like you have kind of ideas of not only just like madness and stuff, but also just more like temperamental things and like humors and stuff. Like,
Yep.
is Hamlet's problem one of acedia or, melancholy or whatever, one of those sorts of 17th century terms for a kind of
Depression or
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, a vaguely depressed kind of complacency, or you kind of, they're still saying that there are these maybe aspects of your behavior or aspects of your conditions that you can't control, but they're not, just because Apollo said so. It's something a bit more complicated going on.
it's
So I
it's a
like that yeah, we've
precursor.
got this
It's a very long precursor to psychoanalysis, but we can
mm,
see this is why people are always applying Freudian readings to Shakespeare. I mean, this
mm,
is why you can see, yeah, that medicalized eye, uh and the ideas of the body, and problems with the body, coming to the fore here in terms of how are they affecting the action and affecting your decision making. Well, this leads me then to the question of what do we mean by tragedy today? So, I mean, you say the word tragedy. I assume romantic tragedy, really. That I think that's the sort of the Romeo and Juliet shadow is a long one.
mm. Or
So,
just I mean, it's like a habitually used term, isn't it, just to describe any horrible event. But
But in terms of, oh, so and so wrote this tragedy, I tend to assume it is, and I think most of our students would assume there's a romance element to it there, which
I
I
suppose that
find
makes
really
sense.
funny.
I mean, that makes sense because, like, I do sometimes read interpretations of Greek and Jacobean tragedies saying that in both contexts you have a kind of waning aristocracy that still holds cultural power, but doesn't is losing its kind of socioeconomic power. So maybe just in the 21st and 20th century, we're not really going to be too interested in some kind of great man falling, but we are maybe going to be more sympathetic to the themes of doomed love for whatever reason.
Well, Arthur Miller provided, I think, quite a useful definition. And he said that modern tragedy is when, quote, a character is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. And then at the same time, this character, quote, fears being torn away from his chosen image of what and who he is in the world. So Miller really emphasizes the common man here, and this sort of, yeah, the sense of dignity going forward. And I wonder if maybe that is a useful metric as we go in to discuss The Great Gatsby. Right, so this brings us to The Great Gatsby.
Yeah, we all know it, don't we?
Presumably that's why we're here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Jay Gatsby, mysterious self-made man, dies, resulting from his infatuation with a former lover. We have this kind of interesting narrator character, Nick Carraway, who kind
The
of
most
leaves.
unreliable of unreliable
Yeah, oh,
narrators.
to say the least. Yeah. It's all that sort of the jazz age and everything. We get a kind of, it probably is the best summation of it, but it's also maybe the best critique of it. All the kind of exciting and gaudy things about it are also maybe
repulsive.
shallow and repulsive, and yeah, exactly.
Well, what I find interesting as well is that it was written right in the middle of this period. So it was written in 1925, set in 22, and yet manages to sum up and encapsulate so much of that period that hadn't even finished yet. So he really had his finger on the pulse. And
Yeah.
wasn't it true that this book wasn't even that popular in its day? It was sort of in the 40s and World War II that this actually then became a sort of classic of that period.
Well, that makes you wonder if maybe it wasn't really that Fitzgerald had his finger on the pulse so much that he could anticipate the character of the decade, having only lived through half of it, and more that just there was such a sort of gap between its publication and its popularization that it's just the sort of go-to version of the 20s we have now. Maybe he kind of made the 20s what they were.
Well, I was wondering about that, if this book has just defined what we remember, or if he managed, and I mean, this does happen, that to pick up on, and it's the critique, it's the satire of it at the same time that makes me think that he had his finger on the pulse a bit more.
Oh yeah, no, I'm sure it's both. Yeah,
he just managed to collect a lot of the tropes that we remember, and then in the 40s this was ossified as people rediscovered this book. So I imagine it's sort of a two-part process here.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah. So yeah, it's popular amongst teachers and students of English literature, isn't it? Because of its very overt use of symbolism. So
yeah, the green light in the Baz Luhrmann version. Boy, he really leaned on that green light maybe a little bit.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I think he was more in love with it than Gatsby. Yeah, it's got all the big lit crit themes as well, hasn't it? All the big ones, class and all that. But the way that, despite using these devices in a very overt and maybe like even kind of paint by numbers way, Fitzgerald uses them in very like ambiguous and unresolvable ways. So we've got these questions here, like, is Gatsby a vindication of American idealism, or is he a kind of does he satirically expose its hollowness, because he turns out to be a sort of fraud, doesn't he? Yeah, there is Nick's kind of ambiguous narration.
Yeah,
and
you
also,
and I have discussed if Nick is very savvy and self-aware, or if he is just a complete himbo is the word that we use.
I think it's kind of one wrapped in the other. I think it's some kind of Russian doll thing going on there. But yeah, and also, yeah, is the symbolism about meaning, or is it almost to distract us from maybe a sense of nihilism at the bottom of the novel? I feel like that might be quite, Fitzgerald might be very actively using these symbolic devices to uh, expose their sort of meaninglessness.
And I think that's what's so difficult about reading this book, is that it is both profoundly earnest and deeply satirical and cynical at the same time. Every
Mm.
sentence, every sentence can be read in both of those ways, and you can't really fully appreciate the book without hitting both of those registers. And
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, like the racism thing, like the book isn't, obviously racism doesn't figure as a main theme in the text, but there are like obviously aspects of it
but
that
there's a
definitely cover
lot.
that. But it's just such a lightning rod, isn't it, for such a kind of incredibly significant theme in our minds, that the way that Fitzgerald employs it is indicative of how just generally the themes of the novel are very
Yes.
ambiguous, or slightly less sort of fraught topics are also portrayed in a similarly ambivalent way.
So our question then is The Great Gatsby a tragedy? By what sort of metric? So in the case for, if we, especially if we're working from Arthur Miller's definition about, a modern tragedy is about this man who will lay down his life to secure his personal dignity. To some extent, Gatsby is willing to do that, but then in doing so, he sort of loses some of his dignity, doesn't he? So I don't,
Yeah,
but so it again, it's that ambiguous line that Fitzgerald is writing, but you could certainly make the case, yes, for that.
I feel like
And
Miller's definition is maybe a bit more politicized around a certain idea. I think
yes,
it's not a sort of, I don't want to be like, I mean, no definition is neutral, is it? But he's got a certain ideal of maybe how tragedy should be going forward. And Gatsby obviously doesn't reflect that. He's not an ordinary man just trying to, he's not a Willy Loman, is he?
yeah.
Just trying to, come good.
But he also isn't an aristocrat. The book makes that painfully clear that he's from this North Dakota working class family. He is kind of a common man who makes good on these sort of aspirational American
Mm.
dream goals. So in Miller's definition, he subscribes to that. And he also weirdly has a foot in the Aristotelian camp as well,
Yeah.
in that
Yeah.
tragedy should represent people who are, quote, better than the average. Well, by virtue of him actually being able to semi realize that American dream and have some of that mobility, the fact that it's labeled satirical or not, The Great
Mm.
Gatsby, he is probably, quote, better than the average in this sort of, American dream critique.
It's like a question of historical values, isn't it? So maybe in ancient Greece, historical values would have prized uh, aristocracy.
Mhm.
Obviously, in America in the 1920s, that's not at all the same. And just being a kind of self-made man, being incredibly rich and successful, that gets you most of the way, doesn't it? Like success within capitalism you know, has a similar accreditation to
Mhm.
maybe what Aristotle would have thought of as nobility.
And we also have the idea of the fatal flaw, the bad decisions. It's just such a wild confluence of circumstances that leads
Mm.
to the situation where he then makes the bad decision not to stop the car to protect Daisy. So it's one bad decision that, well, maybe two if you consider him letting Tom drive his car in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah,
But it's
there are a few contingencies, aren't there? Yeah.
but again, he is caught up in this, this whole series of events, most of them way outside any of his control. So there is a certain fated element, there is that certain bad decision making, and it does seem foreshadowed in the manner of these classical and Renaissance tragedies. All of these car accidents that happened throughout the course of the book, all of this sort of the affair leading up to
Mm.
his decision to protect Daisy. There's more than one affair in the book, and yeah, this issue of you can't repeat the past. It's that little the conception of time and erasing the past and what does the future hold. It is quite ominous. All of this, his
Mm.
his
Yeah.
forward lookingness. This does also map as well pretty perfectly onto the Aristotelian pattern for the tragic plot. So if you recall from the first slide, we have Gatsby and Daisy's affair, which is the sort of the reversal, the upset of these norms, something, going beyond what their society would allow.
Mm.
Then we have the discovery element, which is when they have that awful party in the hotel room and Tom outs Gatsby as a fraud and a criminal, really, and
Mm.
undoes the affair with Daisy. She changes her mind. And then that leads to the calamity and death resolution of the car accident and then Gatsby's murder. So it's funny that this actually does follow that ancient pattern really well.
Yeah, quite closely. Yeah.
Mm.
There's also plenty to discount it as a tragedy, isn't there? I think. So, I mean, however great Gatsby may be in certain terms, this is also kind of clearly ironic, isn't it? He's a liar, a fantasist, a criminal. He's not better than the average, maybe in a pure sense, in the sense that Aristotle saw.
And well, there's that sense of him being rather pathetic a little bit as
Yeah.
well, as we were discussing the sort of the Arthur Miller dignity, which feeds somewhat into this Aristotle's idea of the great man. Does Gatsby actually have and preserve his dignity by
Yeah.
giving up his life for Daisy, who is, I'm sorry, thoroughly unworthy?
Yeah. There's a sort of sense that maybe he's expunged whatever he once was for a kind of artificial new personality or whatever, if you know what I mean. Like that, he doesn't really have any sense of selfhood. He's so beholden to certain values and he can't even properly achieve them. So there's something, maybe not great about that. Equally, I mean, we can talk about society and social factors, structural factors even, as a kind of modern form of fate, but that
The
kind of only really gets you
economic
so far.
gods.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Society as the gods only gets you so far, doesn't it? I don't think it's entirely justifiable to compare, people inevitably fulfilling prophecies with just the snobbishness of the kind of East Egg elite. I don't know whether that's quite that's a bit too extreme to suggest that agency is entirely subordinated to structural issues. So, I mean, in that sense, you've got a sense of the world, a sense of society that's just like far too modern, far too sociologically nuanced to really reflect the kind of more cosmic issues in like tragedy as the Greeks defined it. So I think that's probably kind of undermines its tragic leanings.
I was also thinking about the form as well, and we talk about that Shakespearean integration of comedy, but those are episodic, and it's largely at the beginning, or maybe just to alleviate bits of tension until we get up to that final, death at the end. But here, it's not episodic. It is every sentence more or less has the potential to be funny. This whole thing is actually hilarious and earnest in equal measure. As we were saying, both sentences, every sentence is read on two registers. So does that undermine the sense of tragedy if the whole thing is actually really funny?
Yeah, it's incredibly ironical, isn't it? It's you can't splice the serious from the ironic, unfortunately, or fortunately, maybe. But Nick's narration in particular is very sort of dry, and you never know where you stand. But then, as you were saying, there's these more like overtly comic episodes in it as well. Maya Wolfsheim, there's a lot of anti-Semitic stuff, but there's also a lot of sort of comedy gangster stuff as well, like with the Mola inlaid cufflinks. Vladimir Tostov, bit of joke names there. They're always funny, aren't they? And I love that the bit with the Ripley Snells when Nick just lists off all of the people that visited Gatsby's house, and it's like some kind of Dickensian dramatis persona, Beluga's girls and everything. That's such a great bit. But what is that? That seems almost venturing into a kind of absurdism.
Well, and I suppose at the end of the day, as we state here, it doesn't actually matter whether we can classify The Great Gatsby as a tragedy or not. But I think these are really important questions and points of what do we mean by tragedy, just to get ourselves and students thinking sort of critically about what that even means. Tragedy is such a big umbrella term. We throw that word around a lot. And I don't know about you, but I very rarely give it this much thought about what do I even mean by that.
Yeah,
What are the
I mean, this is a great approach
tragedy?
not only to thinking about the Great Gatsby, but it's also a good one for thinking about tragedy.
Yes.
I I don't think I would have thought as much about the genre uh, through the lens of Gatsby as vice
Mhm.
versa. So I think, yeah, these sorts of kind of big lumping questions definitely help produce nuance, ironically.
They're productive in terms of close reading and understanding form and themes and genre. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this brings us to a little bit of theory that I really love teaching to students because it's but unsurprisingly, it's so visual. It appears a lot in films, and it's really, really easy to teach. I think it's something that clicks quite well for them. So, gaze theory is, in short, just that. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's when any text sort of focuses on issues of how we process things visually, conditions of sight or vision. Unsurprisingly, connected to tragedy, Oedipus is a quite an apt text to apply this to. That's just sort of a happy coincidence here. Um, and gaze theory is a really big umbrella term. There are so many different schools of thought about this. I'm not going to get into all of them here. You can sort of pause the video and read on your own if you want to assign any of these. John Berger is very good. He has some really easy to teach excerpts. The one that I particularly like teaching though is Bentham and Foucault, and it's this idea of the panopticon, or the idea that
Mm.
we police ourselves and change our behavior if we know we're being watched. So the big quotation there is visibility is a trap. Yeah, no, so it's this idea that even if you are being watched, or even if you just think you're being watched but not, you are going to self-regulate because the
Yeah.
gaze holds power. And if you are being seen, or feel like you could even potentially be seen, then there is the equal potential for punishment. So you'll just regulate, and theoretically
Mm.
you can police people with nobody if they worry that they're always being observed. And then there are a number of different sort of theories and perspectives about class and general sort of celebrity status. The higher up you go, the more visible you tend to be to people. There's a lot of media and just surveillance, full stop, especially with servants and surveillance issues.
Mm.
Issues of class there. It's in really intriguing ways. Yes, we have servants, and that's great, and that indicates our power, but are they watching us? And so there's a real tension there, a class tension that's intriguing. But especially
Also,
these.
like, if you don't care about them watching you, that's the other thing. It goes both
Yes,
ways, right? Yeah. If you get up to all sorts of weird things you don't mind about the servants watching because they're nothing to you.
on the understanding that they can't do much,
Yeah,
but that's the tension, is that sometimes they could do
exactly.
things.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Especially as literacy uh, sort of grew over the 19th century. All of a sudden there was a fear of, oh, now my servants can all read. Are they reading my letters and my diaries and learning things about
Mm.
me that they could use against me? So there were a lot of blackmail narratives in the Victorian era. But then we get into issues which I think will connect to to the Great Gatsby quite well, which is the media, and how does the
Mm.
media lean in on this? So, how does gaze theory feed into tragedy then? How is this a sort of crucial element? And I think one of the big ones is these, especially if we connect it back to Bentham and Foucault, the idea of the gods always watching you, but you can't look at them. You can't see them in that same sort of way. So, we're all milling about at their will. Are we doing things wrong? We don't even know. Um,
Mm.
and that idea of irony as well, we as the readers or as the audience, we know things, we have seen certain things that the characters don't, so there is a sort of power dynamic there. That is a crucial element of tragedy. uh yeah, issues about psychology and self-awareness and inward looking, especially as we progress through Shakespeare's time to the present day. There's a lot of introspection that needs to happen and often doesn't, or maybe happens too much.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, too much.
And then we just have general ideas of the gaze and society. Are you behaving in ways that are in accordance with uh, societal norms and laws? And then the revelatory element in Aristotle's sort of a formula here. The discovery. There's sort of an unblinkering, if you will. All of a sudden, I see all of these events that I thought were nothing. Now they have puzzle pieced together, and I see the combination that has led to this moment. Oops, I'm dead. So let's apply some of this gaze theory to The Great Gatsby and tragedy. One of
Bringing it all
the
together. Carry on.
yeah, the synthesis here. One of the big symbols, one of the big tropes in this book is the billboard, the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which is, if you recall from the book, he's this, it's an advert for an oculist, which is since, I think it's funny that it's a defunct oculist. So
Yes.
it's the gaze, something is watching you, but a billboard is sort of meant to be seen, but it's defunct anyway. So there's clearly some sort of eyes of God happening, but it's flawed. Maybe it doesn't exist anymore. Is this whole sort of God is dead, nobody's watching?
Yeah. Well, Wilson says that, doesn't he? God sees everything and points at the billboard, and his neighbor's like, that's a billboard. So
But
yeah, there is that sort of it does explore it overtly.
but it's funny that he thinks that God needs glasses, that there needs to be
Yes.
a corrective element to the vision. That's a very strange. You could really unpack that reading.
Yeah. No, that is really weird. Yeah. And also is a defunct oculist.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. So the novel portrays a very kind of mediatized world, doesn't it? The media play a kind of almost like a kind of Greek chorus type role, don't they?
Oh,
Describing
I like that.
yeah, or maybe almost a Greek chorus, but they're all interested in Gatsby's background. They kind of monitor his his activities. There's investigative reporters knocking at his door and stuff. And indeed, yeah, Gatsby also is interested in. He uses the newspapers to follow Daisy, doesn't he? So we've got this sort of
He
sense of a
surveils
world watching
her.
itself. Yeah, there's a kind of mutual surveillance thing going on, but it's also it gets it wrong a lot, doesn't it, as well? So it's sort of again a mediated gaze.
Well, he understands how to use the gaze here as well, because as you're saying, he uses this to stalk Daisy, really, if we're being honest. But also he
Yeah.
really understands that whole visibility is a trap thing. So he is hyper conspicuous, having these, there are all these rumors about him that he doesn't do anything to stop. He has these incredibly lavish parties where all the media is hanging around, and yet he himself is nowhere to be seen. So, I mean, Nick goes to the party and spends most of the party looking for his host. Nobody knows anything about him. So he really plays
And
with
doesn't even
that.
know it's him when he sees him.
Exactly. Yes, yes. So there's that luring in of this hyper visibility, but ultimately removing himself entirely. He's actually not under the gaze directly. It's sort of
Yeah.
bounced back by a mirror somehow.
Yeah, there's a kind of a kind of visuality that permeates everything, but it's like a sort of false visuality or a fraudulent visuality, which I suppose tells us something about Gatsby, about his
Yes.
background, as much as it tells us about his sort of media savvy.
But inviting himself as well to be perceived as that great man, that Aristotelian great man, but then
Yeah.
not. I mean, there is that absolute remove. It literally is all smoke and mirrors with him, in that sort of, he's bouncing back certain reflections of himself to the gaze and hiding himself almost behind that mirror. I find this really fascinating, how he really understands it and manipulates it. And he and Daisy both know how to manipulate glamour. They talk about how neither of them drink because they know they're always being watched, and this is a way of maintaining control. They never lose control, or they do very very seldomly.
Yeah. Only when it counts. Gatsby's case.
Then this is one of your favorite scenes, the scene at the party with Owl Eyes.
Yeah, he's my favorite character. I think the kind of slightly drunken party guest who is maybe more perceptive than everybody else when he goes through Gatsby's library. So yeah, there's this whole idea that Gatsby is he is a fraud. We all know he's a fraud, but he's this sort of honest one because he has a fake library. He has a kind of a real library, but he would never cut the pages of the books because he doesn't want people to actually think he's like, he doesn't want to go so far as to make people actually think that he's read these things. There's a kind of a weird like honesty and fraudulence all wrapped up in itself there that only Owl Eyes can kind of summarize through this example of the book.
Well, yeah, because Owl Eyes, I mean, if you don't know about page cutting, books used to be sort of printed in a way that when you'd get them, you'd have to cut the pages to be able to read them, cut them from each other with a letter opener. And so Owl Eyes is going through the library, and he used to think because books then nice leather-bound books were so expensive, people used to sort of fake being richer than they were by getting sort of just leather-bound spines on cardboard with nothing in them.
That's what I've got.
I don't even have any books. I've never even seen a book, as you can see here. But I think
But yeah, that's
it's important in this early stage before anyone knows anything about Gatsby. Owl Eyes, who is giving us very little. I mean, he just says, "Wow, you know the pages of his books aren't even cut." That moment there, that itself cuts through a lot of Gatsby's nonsense and smoke and mirrors and gets to the core of what's going on, which is that he's a fraud, but he's a genuine fraud. And
yeah.
so it's a really lovely moment early on that sort of then reflects all the things that are going to sort of slowly come out about Gatsby later over the course of the book. Right. And so the last one is a bit of self-policing and awareness, which sort of is a register throughout the whole book. We've already touched on this a little bit with Nick's narration, where either he is the most self-aware man in the entire world, and this is all done with a bit of a wink, or he is just a complete bimbo who has never once actually thought about what he's saying. So, you have Daisy saying in this ludicrous way, like, I've become very cynical. But you're not sure if she says that as well with a wink. You have no idea how much she thinks about herself sort of externally and how good her self-awareness is.
You're constantly second guessing that on you. That just kind of, it goes down and down forever,
Yes. And then just also the sort of class pretensions and the audience. So Gatsby and Myrtle's behavior changes based on who is seeing them. So they're under that sort of panopticon view of, ooh, if I'm being watched, or I think I'm being watched, this is how I'm going to behave. And then to go back to that issue of class and infidelity, here to some extent we have these houses filled with servants who, Gatsby fires all of his servants when he starts having an affair with Daisy. But Tom doesn't have to, because he is a lot less touchable than Gatsby is, because Tom is a true aristocrat and he doesn't care. So there's that, the phone calls that everyone knows about, but we try really hard not to discuss. It just happens and everyone sweeps it under the rug. So this idea of,
I kind of wondered if that was also about the players involved. So like, because Myrtle's not ever going to be like a serious material threat to Daisy, is she? She's just a kind of fling. Whereas for Gatsby and Daisy, this, Gatsby wants this to be the real deal and wants to kind of topple Tom. So I suppose there's that sort of, although these two infidelities seem like they're the same, we see by their reaction, Tom and Gatsby's reaction to the chance of people finding out about it, we see from that they're actually quite different and that there are very different stakes.
Yeah, and sort of there's a class-based sexism here, which is that Myrtle is, not only not a real threat to Daisy, Tom doesn't care if her reputation is ruined. He introduces her to everybody, including his wife's cousin. So, he really has a sort of thinly veiled disdain for her, whereas Gatsby is very clear that Daisy's reputation needs to come out immaculate. And they talk about how, Daisy managed to, in her youth, go to these different cities and not even really, her reputation came out unscathed. So that's a big element as well of these decision-making processes come down largely to how society is looking at them, and actions are dictated then by the gaze of society.
I mean, that's the funny thing about Nick, isn't it? I mean, obviously he has to see these things for the novel to have any kind of coherence, but he's the only one that is privy to both infidelities. He meets Myrtle and attends that party, and he also sets up Gatsby and Daisy's thing. So he's a sort of, he kind of passes between all of that. So that's kind of that reflects his role as narrator. I mean, I don't know what it tells us about it, but I suppose it shows that he has this kind of fluidity to him, to his identity and to his perspective.
Well, in that he's almost all eyes and no action. He's there to take in and observe. He doesn't really do much of anything, does he?
Well, that's definitely his function in the novel, like as a formal device.
Yes. So I'm going to end on a brief note on our pedagogical practice. We very frequently teach together and like to include a sort of model of dialogues like this for our students, purely because we want them to see that it's okay to debate with us and debate with each other. We're well aware that at a sort of secondary school level, co-teaching is not always going to be an option, but if there is a way to make space for it, we find that our students really appreciate it. And it helps sort of loosen them up a little bit in terms of contributing and feeling comfortable forming their own arguments and then defending those arguments, purely because they see us do this so many times. They learn it's okay to say, I actually really disagree with that reading. Here's why.
Yeah. There are plenty of ways of creating dialogue, aren't there? But this is just one of them. But I'm sure there are plenty of ways you can do it in the classroom context.
And then building on this pedagogical practice, Daniel and I have actually started a literature comedy podcast called Save Me From My Shelf, where we just sort of walk through plots of classic literature and integrate a little bit of analysis in a humorous way. The whole point of this is to make people who are maybe a little bit anxious about reading canonical texts a little bit less nervous. We focus far more on the silly elements of them. So we cover a lot of text, including The Great Gatsby, that are taught at A level and GCSE. So please feel free to check us out if you think that that would be a helpful supplementary tool to teaching. And we take requests as well. So if you're teaching anything, please write in and maybe we'll cover it. Right, and so this is the point where we will stop the video and let you ask any questions. Thank you.